My wife wouldn't understand success. Daniel laughed, lifting his whiskey glass, while his coworkers
To my
smirked around
lovely
the
wife who
table.
tries so hard to keep up,
Vivian's never made
but
real
we all know
money
who
in
the
her
real star
entire
is here.
life.
This
The
is it,
laughter
the
around the
pinnacle,
table
everything
burned
we've worked
deeper
for.
than I wanted
Our
to
legacy
admit.
starts right here.
I sat quietly beside him, staring
That's
at
the
the glowing
spirit.
Harper Lane logo hanging above the ballroom stage, while my husband kept humiliating me like I was some burden he had outgrown. 27 years of marriage. And somehow the man who once loved me now looked embarrassed to even stand beside me. Then Daniel smiled proudly and said, "One day, I'm going to run this company." I almost broke into tears, because the man mocking me for being poor had no idea that I secretly owned every floor of the company he dreamed of controlling. Before we continue, I'd really love to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated by someone you loved? What would you have done if your spouse humiliated you in public like this? Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I truly enjoy reading every message because it reminds me that none of us are alone in moments like these. I used to believe love could survive anything. Bills, loss, exhaustion, aging, even silence. But I learned something painful after 27 years of marriage. Love can survive hardship. What it cannot survive is contempt. Daniel wasn't always cruel. That was the part that hurt the most. When we first met, he was 30 years old and working 2 jobs in Chicago while trying to finish his MBA at night. He drove an old blue Honda with a broken heater, wore cheap department store suits, and apologized every time he took me somewhere modest. "I'll do better one day," he used to tell me. "I promise you won't always have to struggle." Back then, he held my hand like I was the best thing that had ever happened to him. And honestly, I loved him for the man he was before ambition started eating pieces of his soul. We met at a tiny coffee shop near Lake Michigan. I was reading financial reports on my tablet while pretending not to. Daniel spilled coffee on my table and nearly died from embarrassment. "Oh my God," he said, grabbing napkins. "I'm so sorry. Please don't sue me." I laughed so hard I snorted. That was our beginning. Not money, not status, not power. Just 2 exhausted people trying to survive adulthood. Back then, Daniel never cared about appearances. We ate cheap takeout on the floor of my apartment. We watched old movies with the windows open during summer storms. We talked about dreams until 2 in the morning. He wanted success. I wanted peace. For a long time, I thought we balanced each other. But success changed him slowly. Not overnight. That would have been easier to notice. No, it happened piece by piece. The first promotion made him proud. The second made him competitive. The third made him judgmental. By the fourth, I barely recognized the man sleeping beside me. Daniel started caring about things he used to mock: luxury watches, private clubs, expensive whiskey, designer labels, people with important connections. And somewhere along the way, he started looking at me differently too. At first, it was subtle. "You're wearing that tonight? You still drive that old Lexus? You should try to look more polished around my coworkers." Little comments, small cuts, tiny humiliations disguised as advice. I ignored them because I loved him. Women my age are taught to endure things quietly, especially when the world tells us long marriages are something sacred. So, I endured. I smiled when he corrected me in public. I stayed silent when he interrupted me during conversations. I pretended not to notice when he stopped introducing me proudly as his wife. Eventually, he began introducing me with embarrassment already in his voice. "This is Vivian. Just Vivian. Not my beautiful wife. Not the woman who stood beside me for nearly 3 decades. Just Vivian." Like I was some distant relative he felt obligated to acknowledge. And the strangest part, I let him believe I had nothing. I suppose that sounds foolish. But after my father died, and I inherited Harper and Lane Holdings, I made a choice that shocked everyone around me. I refused to become one of those cold people obsessed with power. I didn't want bodyguards following me around. I didn't want magazine covers. I didn't want fake friendships built around money. I had grown up watching wealthy people perform kindness while secretly measuring everyone's value in dollars. It disgusted me. So, I stayed quiet. Michael Grant became the public face of the company. The board protected my privacy, and I continued living simply. I still grocery shopped alone, still cooked dinner myself, still folded laundry while listening to old jazz music on Sunday mornings. I wanted a real life, a normal life, and for many years Daniel gave me that, until the corporate world convinced him that ordinary people were beneath him, especially ordinary women. One evening, about 3 years before everything collapsed, Daniel came home from work furious. They promoted Greg instead of me. He snapped, throwing his keys on the counter. I looked up from cooking soup. I'm sorry. He's not smarter than me. I know. He just has better connections. I walked toward him gently. You'll get another opportunity. But Daniel stared at me with bitterness in his eyes. You don't understand how this works, Vivian. Something about the way he said it stung. What do you mean you don't live in that world? That was the first time I realized my husband had started seeing me as intellectually inferior. Not because I lacked intelligence, because he assumed I lacked status. From then on, things became worse. Every promotion inflated his ego more. Every compliment from executives made him colder at home. Daniel began spending more time networking and less time talking to me. He criticized everything: the curtains, the house, the meals I cooked, even the way I laughed. One night, while getting dressed for a company event, he looked at me standing in the bedroom doorway and sighed heavily. What I asked quietly, you could try harder. I frowned. At what looking like the wife of someone important. Those words stayed with me for months because they revealed something terrifying. Daniel no longer saw me as a person. I had become part of his image, and I was failing the role. Still, I loved him. That's the humiliating truth. Even after the coldness, even after the insults, even after nights spent crying silently beside him while he slept peacefully inches away. I still remembered the young man who once danced with me in the kitchen while pasta boiled over on the stove. I kept hoping he would come back. But people rarely return once ambition teaches them to worship themselves. The night before the company gala, I stood alone in our closet staring at 2 dresses. One black, one navy blue. Simple dresses. Elegant, but understated. Daniel walked in adjusting his cufflinks. That's what you're wearing, he asked immediately. I looked down at the navy dress. What's wrong with it? He hesitated just long enough to hurt me. It's fine. That word, fine. Women always know when fine actually means disappointment. I slowly hung the dress back inside the closet. I can change. Daniel rubbed his forehead impatiently. Vivian, I'm trying to move up in this company. Appearances matter. There it was again. Appearances. Not love, not loyalty, not kindness, just appearances. I nodded quietly and changed dresses while he checked emails on his phone. And as I stood there removing my clothes in silence, I realized something heartbreaking. My husband no longer saw me when he looked at me. He only saw what I failed to add to his status. What Daniel didn't know was that the company he worshipped, the company he was desperately trying to impress, already belonged to me. The Harper Lane executive dinner was held at the Grand Crescent Hotel in downtown Chicago. Crystal chandeliers glowed above marble floors, while waiters in white gloves floated through the ballroom, carrying champagne trays worth more than my first apartment's monthly rent. Daniel loved places like this. You could see it in the way he walked. His shoulders straightened, his voice deepened, his smile sharpened into something polished and ambitious. He belonged to this world now, or at least he desperately wanted to. Meanwhile, I felt like I was attending my own funeral. "Stay close tonight," Daniel whispered as we entered the ballroom. "These people matter. Not you matter. Not you look beautiful. Just these people matter." I nodded quietly. "I understand." He immediately spotted a group of executives near the bar and barely looked back to see if I was following him. I watched him transform within seconds. His laugh became louder, his posture more confident. His entire personality adjusted itself around powerful people, like a flower turning toward sunlight. "Daniel," one of the men called. "Good to see you." Daniel shook hands enthusiastically. "Robert, absolutely. Thanks again for reviewing my proposal last week." Then his eyes flickered toward me briefly. "Oh, and this is Vivian. Just Vivian again. No warmth, no pride." I smiled politely anyway. A blonde woman wearing diamond earrings tilted her head toward me. "So what do you do, Vivian?" I opened my mouth, but Daniel answered before I could. "She mostly stays home." A few people laughed softly. Not cruelly. Worse. Uncomfortably. The kind of laughter people use when they're trying to support someone important. I felt heat crawl up my neck. "I do consulting work remotely," I said calmly. Daniel smirked into his whiskey glass. "Very small scale." There it was again. That subtle humiliation. Always wrapped in charm. Always delivered with a smile. One of the younger executives chuckled. "Well, somebody has to keep Daniel grounded." Daniel laughed harder than anyone. "Oh, trust me. Vivian's definitely not interested in the corporate world." I stared at him quietly. You know what hurt the most? Not the joke. Not even the embarrassment. It was the fact that he genuinely believed I had nothing valuable to contribute. 27 years together, and my husband had no idea who I truly was. A server passed with champagne. I grabbed a glass mostly to keep my hands occupied. Daniel continued talking about company restructuring, leadership opportunities, and expansion plans while the group listened carefully. Every few minutes, he glanced around the room like he was searching for someone more important to impress. That was another thing ambition had done to him. It made him unable to be present. Even during conversations, he was mentally climbing invisible ladders. Suddenly, one of the senior directors lowered his voice. "Have you heard the rumors?" Daniel immediately leaned in. "What rumors? The owner may finally appear publicly this year." That caught everyone's attention. Harper Lane Holdings had always operated differently than most corporations. Officially, Michael Grant was the CEO and public face of the company. But whispers about the true owner had circulated for years. Most employees had never met them. Some believed the owner lived overseas. Others thought it was an entire family dynasty hiding behind shell companies. Only a handful of people knew the truth. And I was standing in the middle of them wearing a navy blue dress. Daniel almost made me change. "Do you know who it is?" someone asked. The senior director shrugged. "All I know is the board treats them like royalty." Daniel laughed confidently. "Well, whoever it is, better recognize talent when they see it." Everyone smiled politely. I took a slow sip of champagne to hide the ache building inside my chest. Then Daniel placed a hand on my lower back. Not affectionately, possessively. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I looked at him. "Yes. You've barely spoken? I'm listening." Well, try not to look so uncomfortable. I blinked slowly. I didn't realize I did. His jaw tightened slightly. Vivian, please, don't make tonight awkward. Something inside me cracked a little, because all evening long, he had been the one humiliating me. And somehow, he still saw himself as the victim. Before I could answer, a familiar voice sounded behind me. Mrs. Wallace. My entire body froze. Daniel turned immediately. Standing a few feet away was Ethan Brooks, member of the board, one of the most respected men in Harper Lane Holdings, and one of the few people on earth who knew exactly who I was. Ethan's expression shifted the second he realized Daniel was beside me. For one dangerous moment, I thought everything was over. Because Ethan looked genuinely startled to see me there. Not socially startled, professionally startled. The kind of reaction that could expose everything. Daniel immediately straightened. Mr. Brooks, he said eagerly, extending his hand. Ethan shook it once without taking his eyes off me. Daniel. Then he looked back at me carefully. His voice softened with unmistakable respect. It's good to see you. I gave the smallest possible shake of my head, barely noticeable. But Ethan understood instantly. Don't reveal anything. His expression became unreadable again. Daniel smiled nervously. You know, Vivian, Ethan answered smoothly. We've crossed paths before. That was technically true. We had spent 6 hours together reviewing acquisition reports 3 days earlier. Daniel looked shocked. I didn't realize my wife had connections at this level. Connections. That word nearly made me laugh. Ethan glanced at me again. You'd be surprised how many things there are to learn about people. For one terrifying second, I thought Daniel might finally notice something, but instead, he chuckled dismissively. Well, Vivian's full of mysteries, apparently. Ethan didn't laugh, not even a little. The silence that followed became strangely heavy. I could almost feel Ethan restraining himself from saying something dangerous. Then Daniel launched into a conversation about company growth projections. I watched Ethan's face carefully while Daniel bragged. Every time my husband exaggerated his accomplishments, Ethan's expression hardened slightly. Not because Daniel lacked talent. Daniel actually was talented. That was part of the tragedy. He could have succeeded without becoming arrogant. But somewhere along the way, he started believing success made him more valuable than other people, especially me. Eventually, Ethan interrupted. Excuse me, Vivian. May I borrow you for a moment? Daniel blinked rapidly. Oh, sure. Ethan offered me his arm politely, and I followed him across the ballroom beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. The second we were out of earshot, he lowered his voice. Are you all right? I smiled faintly. I'm fine. His eyes narrowed. He treats you like that often. I looked away. That's not important. It's important to me. I swallowed hard. Ethan had always respected me, not because I owned the company, but because he respected competence. He had seen me negotiate billion-dollar acquisitions without raising my voice, seen me save entire divisions during financial crises, seen executives twice my age fear disappointing me, and now he had also seen my husband reduce me to a joke over dinner. I can speak to him, Ethan said quietly. No, Vivian? No, I repeated gently. Not yet. Ethan studied my face for a long moment. Then he sighed. He has no idea who he's humiliating. I looked across the ballroom at Daniel. He was laughing loudly again, completely unaware that several people nearby were now staring at him differently after watching Ethan escort me away. No, I whispered. He really doesn't. People assume wealth changes your life overnight. They imagine private jets, champagne parties, and giant mansions with gates so tall they block out the sky. But when my father died and left Harper Lane Holdings to me, the first thing I felt wasn't excitement. It was grief. Deep, suffocating grief. Because no amount of money can soften the sound of a hospital monitor going silent. I was 38 years old when I inherited the company. Too young to feel prepared. Too exhausted to even think about power. My father, Charles Bennett, built Harper Lane from a tiny logistics firm into one of the largest corporate holdings in the Midwest. To the public, he was brilliant. To me, he was simply Dad, a stubborn man who loved black coffee, terrible jazz music, and fixing things around the house himself, even after he became wealthy enough to hire an army of people. But the corporate world consumed him. By the end of his life, he trusted almost no one. Not competitors, not executives, not even relatives, especially relatives. I still remember sitting beside his hospital bed during his final week alive. The room smelled like antiseptic and fading hope. His hands looked smaller than I remembered. Fragile. Human. "Vivian," he whispered weakly. "Promise me something." I squeezed his hand. "Anything. Don't let this company turn you cold." Tears burned my eyes. "It won't." He stared at me for a long moment before speaking again. "Money changes how people love you." Those words haunted me for years, because he was right. The moment people discover you have power, they stop seeing you clearly. Some fear you, some envy you, most want something from you. Very few simply love you. That was why I made the decision that shocked the entire board after his funeral. I refused to become the public face of Harper Lane. "I don't want interviews," I told them. The lawyers stared at me in confusion. "I don't want magazine covers." Executives exchanged nervous glances. "And I don't want my life turned into a spectacle." That was when Michael Grant stepped forward. Michael had worked beside my father for over 20 years, calm, intelligent, fiercely loyal. "If you prefer privacy," he said carefully, "I can continue leading operations publicly." And that was exactly what happened. Michael became the CEO the world recognized. Meanwhile, I quietly became the majority owner behind the scenes. Only the board and a handful of senior executives knew the truth, including Ethan Brooks. For years, the arrangement worked perfectly. I attended meetings privately, approved acquisitions remotely, made major decisions quietly. No headlines, no interviews, no photographs. Just peace, or at least as much peace as wealth allows. When I met Daniel 2 years after inheriting the company, I almost told him the truth immediately. Almost. But then, something beautiful happened. He treated me like a normal woman. Not a billionaire, not a corporate figure, not an opportunity. Just Vivian. We met before social media became obsessed with displaying wealth online. Daniel never Googled me, never cared about my family background, never asked suspicious questions. He fell in love with me because I made him laugh, because I listened when he spoke, because we understood each other. At least I thought we did. I remember the night he proposed. It was raining so hard, the restaurant lost power for almost 20 minutes. Daniel got down on one knee beside candlelight while thunder shook the windows. "I know I'm not rich yet," he said nervously, "but I swear I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy." I cried harder than he did, because for the first time since inheriting Harper Lane, I felt seen as a human being instead of a financial asset. So, I stayed quiet, and for many years, silence protected our happiness. Daniel worked his way upward through different companies before eventually joining Harper Lane Holdings. Ironically, he was thrilled when he got hired there. "This place is different," he told me after his first month. "Leadership actually rewards talent." I smiled softly when he said that. because I had personally approved several employee development initiatives he admired. Sometimes I listened to him complain about executives during dinner, while secretly knowing their salaries, performance reviews, and scandals. The strange thing was, I never abused that power. Never once. I never accelerated Daniel's promotions. Never interfered with evaluations. Never manipulated outcomes to help him. I wanted every success he earned to belong entirely to him. And for years, he succeeded honestly. That was what made his transformation so heartbreaking. The higher Daniel climbed, the more obsessed he became with status. I started noticing changes in the way he spoke about people. He mocked co-workers with cheaper suits, criticized neighborhoods he considered middle class, laughed at older employees who struggled with technology. And eventually, he started speaking about me the same way. One afternoon, I overheard him on the phone with a colleague in his office at home. "No, my wife isn't really connected socially," he said casually. "She's more simple." Simple. I stood frozen in the hallway, holding folded laundry, while those words echoed inside my chest. Not intelligent, not kind, not loyal, simple, as though simplicity made me lesser. That night, I stared at myself in the bathroom mirror for nearly an hour. I looked exactly the same as I always had. Soft brown hair, minimal makeup, comfortable clothes, a woman approaching 60 with laugh lines around her eyes and grief hidden beneath her smile. The same woman Daniel once adored. So what changed? The answer terrified me. Success had taught him to admire surfaces more than souls. And because I never displayed wealth publicly, he slowly convinced himself I lacked value. The cruelest part, sometimes I almost told him the truth, especially during the harder years. There were nights Daniel sat at the kitchen table panicking over finances while planning career moves. "I just need one major promotion," he'd say, "one breakthrough." And I could have ended all his stress instantly. I could have handed him financial security beyond imagination. But every time I considered it, I remembered my father's warning. Money changes how people love you. I needed to know whether Daniel loved me, or the advantages I could provide. Unfortunately, life answered that question slowly and painfully. By our 25th anniversary, Daniel no longer looked at me with affection. He evaluated me, measured me, compared me, and eventually became embarrassed by me. One evening, after a corporate fundraiser, I overheard him speaking to his mother in the driveway. "She doesn't fit this world anymore," he admitted quietly. Margaret sighed dramatically. "I've been telling you that for years. You don't understand." "No, Daniel. You don't understand. Men at your level need sophisticated wives." Sophisticated wives? I sat inside the house listening through the cracked kitchen window while my heart broke in complete silence. Then Margaret said something that changed everything. "There's a woman named Vanessa Carter I want you to meet." And for the first time in 27 years of marriage, I felt genuinely afraid that my husband was becoming someone I could no longer recognize. The first time I met Vanessa Carter, she walked into the room like she already owned it. Tall, elegant, perfect blonde waves resting against the shoulders of a cream-colored designer coat that probably cost more than my first car. Margaret Wallace practically glowed beside her. "Oh, Vivian," my mother-in-law said with artificial sweetness, "this is Vanessa. Her father owns several luxury properties downtown." Vanessa smiled politely and extended her hand. "It's lovely to meet you." Her voice was smooth, practiced. The kind of voice wealthy people develop after years of learning how to sound warm without revealing anything real. I shook her hand gently. "You too." Daniel stood nearby, adjusting his watch, while Margaret continued praising Vanessa like she was presenting a prize horse. "She's on the board of 2 charities," Margaret announced proudly, and she studied international business in London. Vanessa laughed modestly. Oh, Margaret exaggerates. No, I don't, Margaret insisted. Women like you are rare these days. The message behind her words was painfully obvious. Women like me apparently were not. I glanced toward Daniel, waiting for him to interrupt the humiliation. He didn't. Instead, he smiled. That smile hurt more than anything Margaret said, because it meant he agreed. Dinner that night felt unbearable from the moment we sat down. Margaret had invited several guests to celebrate Daniel being considered for regional vice president at Harper Lane. Daniel couldn't stop talking about it. This promotion changes everything he said while pouring wine. It puts me directly in front of executive leadership. Vanessa looked impressed. That's huge. Daniel nodded proudly. It's competitive, though. Harper Lane doesn't promote people unless they think long-term. I nearly smiled at that, because technically speaking, I was Harper Lane. And I had personally reviewed leadership recommendations every quarter for years. Daniel didn't know that the board already considered him talented but increasingly problematic. His numbers were excellent. His ego was becoming dangerous. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed Daniel's arm. You deserve it, sweetheart. Then her eyes drifted toward me. It helps when successful men surround themselves with ambitious people. The silence after that sentence felt deliberate, sharp. I lowered my fork slowly. Daniel cleared his throat but said nothing. Not one word. Vanessa glanced between us awkwardly before speaking carefully. So, Vivian, what kind of consulting do you do? I answered calmly. Mostly financial strategy. Daniel chuckled softly into his wineglass. Very small projects. There it was again. That constant need to minimize me. I looked at him quietly. You've never actually asked about my clients. Daniel shrugged. Well, you work from home. So, he gave me the same look people give children when correcting them gently. I'm just saying it's different from running major corporate operations. The irony nearly suffocated me. Because earlier that same morning, I had approved a multi-million-dollar acquisition, while Daniel struggled through a regional budget presentation 2 floors below my executive office. But I stayed silent. Margaret sighed dramatically. You know, Vivian, there's nothing wrong with women wanting more for themselves. I met her eyes. I never said there was. I just think Daniel has outgrown this simple little life. Simple little life. Vanessa immediately tried to soften the tension. I think there's value in simplicity. Margaret waved dismissively. That's easy to say when you already have status. Daniel laughed lightly. I'm just trying to build something bigger for our future. I stared at him for a moment. Our future. He frowned slightly. What's that supposed to mean? Before I could answer, his phone buzzed. The second he saw the screen, his entire posture changed. He stood immediately. Excuse me, I need to take this. He walked toward the kitchen with sudden urgency. Margaret leaned closer to Vanessa the second he disappeared. You see what I mean? She whispered loudly enough for me to hear. That's what high-level leadership looks like. Vanessa looked uncomfortable. Meanwhile, I sat there wondering when exactly my marriage had become a business transaction everyone else felt entitled to evaluate. A few minutes later, Daniel returned, looking energized. That was Ethan Brooks. Margaret gasped softly. The Ethan Brooks. Daniel grinned proudly. He wants me involved in a leadership strategy meeting next month. Vanessa looked impressed. That's incredible. Daniel nodded confidently. I'm telling you, I'm closer than ever. Then he looked directly at me. You probably wouldn't understand how important this is. Something inside me tightened painfully. 27 years together, And somehow my husband genuinely believed I couldn't comprehend leadership pressure or responsibility. If only he knew. Later that evening, while everyone moved into the living room for dessert, I stepped outside onto the patio for air. Cold Chicago wind brushed against my face while city lights shimmered below the hilltop house. For a few peaceful seconds, I simply breathed. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Vanessa. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself. Mind if I join you? Not at all. We stood in silence for a moment before she spoke carefully. I hope this doesn't sound strange, but you seem different from what Margaret described. I let out a soft laugh. That's usually a good sign. Vanessa smiled faintly. She talks about you like you're helpless. I stared out at the skyline. I'm not. I didn't think so. There was something calculating behind Vanessa's eyes. Not cruel exactly, just observant, like someone constantly searching for opportunities. Then she asked casually, "Do you ever attend Daniel's corporate events sometimes?" Interesting. I looked at her. Why? She hesitated just slightly too long. Oh, no reason. I've just heard Harper Lane's executive circles are extremely private. My instincts sharpened immediately. That question wasn't casual. Vanessa wasn't curious about Daniel. She was curious about access, power, connections, and suddenly I understood something important. Margaret believed she was introducing Daniel to a sophisticated woman. But Vanessa Carter wasn't emotionally interested in my husband. She was strategically interested in Harper Lane. Daniel simply hadn't realized it yet. A few days later, I attended a private board meeting downtown. Ethan sat across from me reviewing leadership assessments while Sophia Reynolds organized reports beside him. Daniel Wallace, Ethan said, finally sliding a file toward me. I opened it slowly. Performance metrics exceptional. Team results strong. Leadership potential high. Then came the concerns section. Arrogance increasing. Boundary issues with subordinates. Frequent self-promotion. Questionable discretion regarding internal discussions. I felt sick reading it. Sophia adjusted her glasses carefully. There have also been reports that he discusses confidential company matters socially. My stomach tightened. With who we're still investigating. Ethan studied my face. You don't have to review this personally if it's too difficult. No, I said quietly. I do. Because this wasn't just about business anymore. This was my husband, the man I once trusted with every vulnerable part of myself. And somewhere between ambition and ego, he had started turning into someone dangerous. Not evil, just hollow. That night, Daniel came home excited. You'll never believe this, he said, loosening his tie. Vanessa knows people connected to commercial real estate expansion. I looked up from my book. Really? Yeah. Her network could be huge for someone in my position. There it was. Not attraction, opportunity. Daniel was beginning to see people the same way corporations see assets. Useful or not useful. And for the first time in our marriage, I realized my husband had already started replacing me in his mind long before asking for a divorce. Margaret Wallace had a talent for making people feel small without ever raising her voice. That was what made her cruelty so exhausting. It arrived wrapped in elegance, hidden behind polite smiles and expensive perfume. A week after the dinner with Vanessa, Margaret invited us to what she called a small family gathering at her country club outside Chicago. I almost declined, but Daniel insisted. It's important, he said while adjusting his tie in the bedroom mirror. My mother's social circle includes people connected to Harper Lane investors. Everything was about networking now. Every dinner, every conversation, every human interaction. I stood behind him, fastening my earrings slowly. When was the last time we went somewhere just because we wanted to enjoy ourselves? Daniel frowned at his reflection. What does that mean? It means you never relax anymore. He let out a tired sigh. Vivian, this is how success works. There it was again, that phrase he used whenever he wanted to justify becoming colder. I didn't answer. The country club looked exactly like the kind of place my father hated. Massive chandeliers, white marble staircases, women wearing diamonds large enough to pay college tuition. Men discussing investments like they were discussing sports scores. Margaret spotted us immediately. "Oh, there you are." She air-kissed Daniel's cheek before glancing at me. "Vivian." No warmth, just acknowledgement. I smiled politely anyway. Inside the private dining room, several couples were already seated around a long, polished table overlooking the golf course. And right beside Margaret sat Vanessa Carter. Of course, Vanessa stood gracefully when we approached. "Daniel." The way she said his name was subtle, smooth, practiced, not flirtatious enough to be inappropriate, just enough to make a man feel important. I noticed Daniel stand slightly taller. Margaret noticed too, and she looked delighted. Dinner began with harmless conversation about real estate markets and luxury developments downtown. I stayed mostly quiet while listening carefully. That was something people underestimated about quiet women. "We hear everything." One of the men across the table laughed while describing a recent business deal. "People trust appearances," he said. "That's how the game works." Daniel nodded immediately. "Absolutely. Image is everything in corporate leadership." My stomach tightened. Vanessa glanced toward him. "That's probably true at Harper Lane, especially." Daniel leaned back confidently. "The higher you go, the more they evaluate every detail of your life." Margaret sighed dramatically beside him. "That's why wives matter so much." I knew what was coming before she even looked at me. A successful man needs a partner who elevates his image. The table became uncomfortably quiet. Daniel stared down at his wine glass. He could have stopped her. One sentence. That was all it would have taken. Instead, he stayed silent. Again. Vanessa cleared her throat carefully. "I think loyalty matters more than appearances." Margaret waved dismissively. "Loyalty is expected. Sophistication is rare." I looked directly at her. "What exactly qualifies as sophistication?" Margaret smiled tightly. "Well, ambition, influence, presentation." Her eyes drifted over my simple black dress. "You know, women who understand high-level environments." The insults sat between us like broken glass. And suddenly, I felt tired. Not angry, not emotional. Just tired. Tired of shrinking myself so everyone else could feel bigger. Daniel finally spoke. "Mom, let's not do this tonight." But his voice lacked conviction. Margaret leaned toward him immediately. "I'm only trying to help you." Then she lowered her voice slightly. "You're close to a major promotion, Daniel. People notice these things." These things, meaning me. I stared at my plate while humiliation burned through my chest. 27 years. 27 years beside that man. And somehow, I had become these things. Vanessa looked uncomfortable now. Even she seemed disturbed by how openly Margaret treated me. But what happened next hurt far worse. Daniel exhaled heavily and said quietly, "She's just worried about my future." The words hit me harder than a slap. Because he didn't deny it. He didn't defend me. He agreed. Margaret reached over and squeezed his hand proudly. "You deserve more than an ordinary life." Ordinary. That word echoed inside my head for the rest of the meal. Because the truth was almost laughable. The ordinary woman sitting quietly beside them owned a company worth billions, but none of them respected simplicity enough to recognize dignity when it sat directly in front of them. Later that evening, I stepped into the hallway outside the dining room to breathe. The walls were lined with gold-framed paintings and soft lighting designed to make wealthy people feel important. I leaned against the wall for a moment and closed my eyes. Then I heard voices around the corner. Margaret and Daniel. "You cannot keep dragging Vivian into these executive circles," Margaret whispered sharply. "People are noticing." Daniel sounded exhausted. "She's my wife, for now." Silence. A long, terrible silence. My entire body froze. Margaret continued. "Daniel, listen to me carefully. Men at your level don't stay married to women who hold them back." "She doesn't hold me back. You just admitted she doesn't fit this world anymore." "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself. Then Margaret lowered her voice further. "Vanessa understands ambition. She understands influence. She could open doors for you." Daniel sighed. "You're exaggerating." "No, sweetheart. I'm being realistic." Another silence followed, and then came the sentence that shattered something deep inside me. "I just don't know if Vivian and I want the same future anymore." I stopped breathing. Not because he sounded angry, because he sounded sincere. That was the moment I realized this wasn't temporary. This wasn't stress, or insecurity, or career pressure. My husband genuinely believed he was evolving beyond me. And somehow, I had become the embarrassing reminder of the life he wanted to escape. I quietly walked away before they could see me. Back inside the dining room, Vanessa stood near the bar, scrolling through her phone. When she noticed me, she smiled politely. "You okay?" I nodded automatically, just needed air. She studied my face carefully. "You know, Margaret can be intense. That's one word for it." Vanessa hesitated. Then she lowered her voice slightly. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're the problem." That surprised me. I looked at her more carefully. "Then what is?" She glanced toward the hallway where Daniel had disappeared. "Sometimes people get addicted to becoming someone important." Her answer lingered between us. Because despite her ambition, Vanessa understood something Daniel didn't. Power changes people, and not always for the better. Then she asked casually, "So how involved are you with Harper and Lane?" There it was again, that curiosity, carefully disguised. I kept my expression neutral. "Not very." Vanessa tilted her head. "Really, Daniel talks about the company constantly. He loves his work, I can tell." She smiled softly. "But you don't seem impressed by status." I almost laughed. If only she knew. At that exact moment, my phone vibrated quietly inside my purse. A private message from Sophia Reynolds. "Board review moved to Thursday. Ethan requests your presence." I locked the screen immediately before Vanessa could accidentally see it, but not quickly enough to miss the flicker of curiosity in her eyes. Interesting. Very interesting. By the time Daniel and I drove home later that night, silence filled the car like fog. Chicago lights blurred past the windows, while soft jazz played quietly through the speakers. Finally, Daniel spoke. "You barely talked tonight." I stared ahead calmly. There wasn't much to say. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "My mother means well." I let out a quiet laugh. "That's comforting. She worries about perception." "No," I said softly. "She worries about status." Daniel's jaw tightened. "In my world, those things matter." I turned slowly toward him. "And what exactly is your world now, Daniel?" He didn't answer immediately. That silence told me everything, because once upon a time, his world had been us. Now It was power, and I was slowly disappearing from it. The divorce papers were waiting for me on the kitchen counter. At first, I thought they were work documents. Daniel often left folders everywhere lately: budgets, leadership proposals, networking notes scribbled with names of executives he desperately wanted to impress. But this folder was different. White, clean, intentional. My heart started pounding before I even opened it. Maybe women instinctively recognize the shape of betrayal long before their minds accept it. I slowly placed my purse down beside the sink. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and rain tapping against the windows. Chicago winters always carried a loneliness that felt heavier at night. I opened the folder carefully. Petition for dissolution of marriage, 27 years. Reduced to legal language on expensive paper. For a moment, I genuinely couldn't breathe. I lowered myself slowly into a kitchen chair while my hands trembled against the pages. Daniel Wallace, Vivian Wallace. No children. Division of assets pending review. The cruelty of legal paperwork is how emotionless it feels. No mention of memories. No mention of promises. No mention of the thousands of ordinary moments that once built a life together. Just signatures waiting at the bottom of a page. I stared at them for a very long time. Then I heard the garage door open. Daniel was home. His footsteps moved through the hallway before he entered the kitchen, loosening his tie. The second he saw the papers in my hands, his expression tightened. Neither of us spoke at first. Finally, he sighed heavily. I was going to talk to you tonight. I looked up slowly. Were you? He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down like this was some uncomfortable business meeting. Not the destruction of our marriage. I think we both know things haven't been working for a while. I almost laughed at how carefully rehearsed he sounded, like he'd practiced this speech in his car. What exactly isn't working? I asked quietly. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Vivian? No, tell me. He leaned back in the chair and exhaled slowly. We've grown apart. There it was, the universal lie people tell when they don't want to admit the truth is uglier. I stared at him. No, I said softly. You grew ashamed of me. His jaw tightened immediately. That's not fair, isn't it? He stood and walked toward the kitchen island, restless now. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. I closed the folder carefully. Then explain it to me. Daniel laughed bitterly. That's exactly the problem. The words hung in the air, sharp, cruel, calculated. I felt something cold move through my chest. What's that supposed to mean? He turned toward me fully now. It means I'm trying to build something bigger with my life, Vivian. And I'm stopping you. You don't support the life I'm moving toward? I stared at him in disbelief. 27 years. 27 years of supporting every dream he ever had. I worked quietly beside him through layoffs, stress panic attacks, financial struggles, endless late nights and career disappointments. And now he spoke about me like I was dead weight attached to his ankle. I supported you before anyone else did, I whispered. Daniel's face hardened slightly. And I appreciate that. Appreciate, not love, not honor. Appreciate. Like I was an old employee he no longer needed. You deserve someone better suited for this world, he continued carefully. I looked at him for a long moment. You mean someone richer? That's not what I said. You didn't have to. Daniel looked away first. That silence told the truth his mouth refused to say. I stood slowly from the table. So that's it. It's not that simple. No, I asked quietly. Because from where I'm standing, it seems very simple. Daniel suddenly sounded frustrated. You refuse to grow, Vivian. I blinked in shock. Excuse me. You hide from opportunities. You avoid social circles. You don't care about ambition. I almost laughed. If only he knew how absurd those words truly were. You think I lack ambition? I think you stopped trying years ago. That sentence hurt more than all the others combined, because Daniel genuinely believed it. He truly saw me as small, ordinary, unsuccessful, a woman with nothing meaningful left to offer the world. And suddenly, I realized something devastating. My husband had spent years creating an imaginary version of me inside his head. One weak enough for him to look down on. One simple enough for him to outgrow. Meanwhile, the real me had been sitting right in front of him the entire time. You know what's sad? I asked softly. Daniel crossed his arms. What you stopped seeing me long before you stopped loving me. Something flickered in his face then. Guilt, maybe, or discomfort. But it disappeared quickly. I didn't come home to fight. No, I said quietly. You came home to leave? Rain continued tapping softly against the windows while silence filled the kitchen. Then Daniel finally said the thing I think had been sitting inside him for years. I need someone who understands the level I'm trying to reach. There it was, the truth. Raw and ugly. Not love, status, not connection, image. I nodded slowly, and Vanessa Carter understands that level. Daniel's eyes widened slightly. This isn't about Vanessa, but you've thought about it. He didn't answer. Another silence. Another confession. I felt strangely calm suddenly. Not because I wasn't hurting, because the worst pain had already happened. The illusion was gone. I no longer had to wonder whether my husband respected me. Now I knew. Daniel walked back toward the table and pushed the papers gently closer to me. I think this is the best decision for both of us. Both of us. What a fascinating thing people say when making selfish choices. I looked down at the signature line, then slowly reached for the pen. Daniel frowned immediately. You're signing them now. I met his eyes. Why wouldn't I? For the first time that night, he looked unsettled. Maybe he expected tears, begging, anger. But heartbreak can become very quiet once something inside you finally breaks completely. My signature looked strangely elegant across the paper. Vivian Wallace. Done. 27 years ended in less than 10 seconds. Daniel stared at the papers like he couldn't quite process what had happened. That's it. I placed the pen down carefully. That's it. You're not even going to fight for us. I almost smiled at the hypocrisy. Fight for us, after he spent years humiliating me, after allowing his mother to treat me like trash, after slowly replacing love with ambition. No, Daniel, I said softly. I'm too tired to beg someone to value me. His expression shifted slightly then. Not regret exactly, but uncertainty, as if my calmness frightened him more than tears would have. I stood and picked up my purse. I'm going upstairs. Vivian. I paused. For a moment, I thought maybe he would apologize. Maybe some forgotten piece of the man I once loved would finally reappear. Instead, he said quietly, I hope someday you understand why I had to do this. I closed my eyes briefly. Then I turned toward him one last time. And for the first time in years, I let him hear the truth hiding beneath my silence. I hope someday, I whispered, you realize what you threw away. Then I walked upstairs without looking back. The second the bedroom door closed behind me, my composure shattered. I pressed my hand over my mouth to stop the sob that escaped my chest. Not because I lost a wealthy husband. Not because I feared being alone. but because the man I loved had spent years believing I was worthless, while building his entire future inside the company I owned. And somehow, he still had no idea. I barely slept after signing the divorce papers. The house felt unfamiliar now. Every room carried memories that suddenly seemed fake. The kitchen where Daniel once danced with me while pancakes burned on Sunday mornings. The living room where we spent Christmas Eve wrapped in blankets during snowstorms. The bedroom where he used to hold my hand while falling asleep. Now every corner felt haunted by the slow death of a marriage I had spent years trying to protect alone. At 4:30 in the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely. I made coffee in silence and stood at the kitchen window watching snow drift across the dark Chicago streets. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to stop pretending. Stop pretending Daniel still respected me. Stop pretending ambition hadn't poisoned him. Stop pretending love could survive humiliation forever. My phone buzzed softly against the counter. Sophia Reynolds. I answered immediately. Good morning, Sophia. Good morning, Miss Wallace. Her voice was calm and professional as always. But beneath it, I sensed hesitation. The board meeting has been moved to today at 11. I closed my eyes briefly. Why new information surfaced overnight regarding several internal concerns? I already knew what that meant. Daniel. I wrapped my hand tighter around my coffee mug. Has Ethan reviewed everything? Yes. A pause followed. Then Sophia spoke more carefully. There are concerns about inappropriate disclosures of confidential information. Pain moved sharply through my chest. Even now, part of me wanted to defend him. Not because he deserved it, because once upon a time, I loved him enough to protect him from anything. What kind of disclosures? I asked quietly. Potential discussions involving expansion plans and executive restructuring. Vanessa. It had to be Vanessa. I stared out at the falling snow while exhaustion settled heavily over me. Understood, I said softly. We'll see you at 11. After the call ended, I stood there for a very long time. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Daniel. He looked exhausted too. Dark circles under his eyes. Wrinkled dress shirt. A man already unraveling beneath the weight of choices he still refused to fully face. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he noticed the coffee. You made some. I nodded once. There's more in the pot. The normalness of the exchange almost broke my heart. 27 years together trains people into habits that survive even after love begins dying. Daniel poured himself coffee quietly before leaning against the counter across from me. I didn't sleep either, he admitted. I stared into my cup. Okay. He frowned slightly at my coldness, not cruelly, almost confused, as though he expected emotional devastation, but not emotional distance. I know last night was hard, he said carefully. I almost laughed. Hard. Such a small word for watching your marriage collapse. Daniel, I said softly, please don't do this. Do what pretend you're worried about my feelings now. His jaw tightened. I do care about you. Not enough. The silence that followed felt endless. Finally, he rubbed his forehead tiredly. I have a major leadership review today. There it was again. Work. Always work. Always ambition. Even the morning after ending our marriage. I hope it goes well, I said calmly. He studied my face carefully. You mean that? Yes. And strangely enough, I did. Despite everything, I still didn't want him destroyed. I simply no longer wanted to be destroyed beside him. Daniel looked unsettled by my composure again. Then his phone buzzed. The second he saw the screen, his expression sharpened with excitement. "Ethan Brooks just confirmed I'll be attending the executive restructuring meeting next week." Of course he was excited. He still believed his life was about to improve, still believed success waited just beyond the next corporate door. What he didn't know was that the board meeting happening today would determine whether his future at Harper and Lane survived at all. "You seem happy," I said quietly. Daniel gave a small smile. "This could change everything for me." I looked at him for a long moment. "It already has." He frowned slightly clearly, not understanding what I meant. Then he glanced at the clock. "I need to get ready." Without another word, he disappeared upstairs. I remained standing in the kitchen, listening to the silence he left behind. By 10:30, I arrived at Harper and Lane headquarters through the private underground entrance reserved for executive leadership. No cameras, no public attention. Exactly the way I preferred it. Sophia met me near the elevator, holding a tablet against her chest. She wore her usual charcoal gray suit and calm expression, though I could tell she was worried. "You look tired," she said gently as we stepped into the executive elevator. "So do you." She sighed softly. "The board is divided." I leaned back against the mirrored wall. How bad? Sophia hesitated. "Some members want immediate disciplinary action." My chest tightened painfully. Against Daniel, yes. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor. Quiet, elegant, power hidden beneath polished glass walls and soft lighting. People often imagine corporate leadership as glamorous. In reality, it feels more like controlled warfare. Ethan Brooks waited inside the conference room beside several board members reviewing documents. The second I entered, everyone stood respectfully. Even after all these years, that reaction still felt strange to me. Not empowering. Heavy. "Good morning, Vivian," Ethan said quietly. I nodded. "Morning." The meeting began immediately. Financial projections, leadership restructuring, expansion approvals. Then finally, Daniel Wallace. Ethan slid the file toward me carefully. Human Resources flagged multiple concerns. I opened the report slowly. Every page hurt worse than the last. Witness statements, internal complaints, reports of arrogant conduct toward junior staff, excessive discussion of confidential initiatives outside approved channels, and finally, possible disclosure of executive restructuring information to unauthorized individuals. Vanessa Carter. I already knew it, but seeing it written formally made my stomach turn. One board member spoke sharply. "He lacks discretion." Another added coldly, "He's ambitious beyond his maturity level." I closed the folder carefully. He's still one of the strongest regional managers we have. Ethan watched me closely. That may no longer matter. The room fell silent. I knew what everyone was waiting for. My decision. Not as Daniel's wife, as owner of the company. That realization nearly broke me. One older board member folded his hands. "Vivian, we need to know whether your personal relationship compromises your objectivity." The question stung because it was fair. I inhaled slowly before answering. "No." Ethan's gaze softened slightly. I continued carefully. "Daniel will be evaluated by the same standards as everyone else. No favoritism, no revenge, just truth." That was the only thing left now. Sophia placed another document in front of me. "Additionally, we need approval regarding next week's public leadership announcement." I looked down at the proposal. After years of remaining invisible, the board wanted me to appear publicly, as owner of Harper and Lane Holdings. The room waited silently, and suddenly, I understood exactly what was about to happen. Daniel would walk into that meeting believing his future was finally beginning. Believing promotion and recognition were waiting for him. He had no idea the woman he divorced the night before would be standing at the center of the entire company. I slowly signed the approval papers. Then I looked up at Ethan. Prepare the announcement. The atmosphere inside Harper Lane changed almost overnight. You could feel it in the elevators, in the hallways, in the way executives lowered their voices when discussing the upcoming leadership announcement. Rumors spread through the company faster than official emails ever could. The owner is finally appearing publicly. Nobody knows why. Some say the board forced it. Some say there's a massive restructuring coming. Some say senior leadership is about to be replaced. For the first time in years, even employees at Daniel's level seemed nervous. And Daniel. He was thriving on the tension. He came home energized every night, talking endlessly about corporate politics while packing more ambition into every sentence than emotion. "The executive floor has been insane this week," he said one evening while loosening his tie. "Security protocols changed. Private meetings everywhere." I stood in the kitchen, slicing vegetables for dinner. "That sounds stressful." "No," he said with a grin. "It sounds promising." Promising. That word made my stomach ache. Because he still believed he was climbing upward. He still had no idea the ground beneath him was already shifting. Daniel poured himself whiskey and leaned against the counter. "I heard the owner might be attending next week's leadership summit in person." I kept my expression calm. "Really?" "Yeah. Apparently almost nobody's met them." He laughed softly. "Imagine having that kind of power." I looked at him quietly. "What would you do with it?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "I'd build something bigger. Bigger than this." He gestured vaguely around the house. "Our home, the place where we built nearly 3 decades together." And somehow he spoke about it like it was temporary housing for a life he planned to outgrow. I lowered my eyes back to the cutting board before he could see the hurt in mine. Then he added casually, "Honestly, the owner's probably some ruthless billionaire who hasn't lived a normal day in years." I almost smiled at the irony. If only he knew that the ruthless billionaire spent Sunday mornings gardening barefoot and cried during old romantic movies. But Daniel no longer saw me clearly enough to imagine complexity inside me. A few days later, I arrived at headquarters early for a confidential executive review meeting. As always, I used the private entrance beneath the building. No cameras, no attention. Sophia walked beside me through the executive corridor while reviewing schedules on her tablet. "The Leadership Summit seating chart is finalized," she said. "And Daniel." She hesitated carefully. "He's seated in the front executive section." Of course he was. He'd interpret that as proof of promotion potential. My chest tightened. "Has the ethics review progressed?" "Yes." And Sophia exhaled softly. "We confirmed multiple inappropriate discussions involving Vanessa Carter." I stopped walking. Anything classified? Not fully, but enough to raise serious concerns. Pain spread slowly through my chest. Daniel wasn't corrupt. Not truly, but ambition had made him careless. Desperate men often mistake attention for loyalty. And Vanessa understood that perfectly. Inside the boardroom, Ethan Brooks stood near the windows overlooking downtown Chicago. The morning sunlight reflected against the glass towers while snow drifted softly below. Beautiful, cold, controlled, much like the corporate world itself. Ethan turned when I entered. "You look exhausted." "I am." His expression softened slightly. "You can still stop this." I stared at him. "Stop what the public reveal." I walked toward the window slowly. "No." "Vivian?" I spent years hiding because I wanted a normal life. And now I look down at the city beneath us. Now I think hiding allowed too many people to mistake kindness for weakness. Ethan studied me carefully, but said nothing. A few hours later, while leaving a strategy meeting, I stepped into the private executive elevator alone, or so I thought. Just before the doors closed, someone rushed inside. Daniel. The second he looked up and saw me standing there, confusion flashed across his face. Vivian. I froze internally, but kept my expression calm. He glanced around the luxurious executive elevator. Dark wood paneling, private access controls, restricted executive floor indicator. Then back at me. What are you doing up here? For one dangerous second time seemed to stop completely. I answered smoothly. I was meeting someone. Daniel frowned immediately. On the executive floor? Yes, with who I looked directly at him. Does it matter? The elevator descended in silence. I could feel him studying me carefully now. Really studying me. Maybe for the first time in years. Then he laughed awkwardly. Wow, I didn't realize you had mysterious executive connections. I forced a small smile. Apparently, there's a lot you don't realize. The doors opened onto the lower management floor. Daniel stepped out slowly, but hesitated before leaving completely. Wait. I looked at him. Have we met Ethan Brooks before the gala? The question hit me like ice water. I kept my face neutral. Why would you ask that he acts strange around you? My pulse quickened slightly. In what way? Daniel frowned. Respectful. I almost laughed at the absurdity of that answer. Respectful. As though respect itself had become suspicious, because he no longer gave it to me. Before I could answer, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen immediately. Vanessa. I saw the name clearly. Daniel quickly pocketed the phone. I should go. Of course, always moving, always climbing, always chasing something. That evening, I attended a private dinner with several board members at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the river. The conversation focused entirely on the upcoming announcement. Public reaction will be intense, one board member warned. You've stayed invisible for nearly 20 years. Another added, the media will go crazy once they realize who owns Harper Lane. I barely listened, because across the restaurant, through the glass walls overlooking the skyline, I suddenly saw Daniel and Vanessa. Together, not romantic, not yet, but close enough to make my stomach twist painfully. They sat at a private table near the far side of the rooftop lounge. Vanessa leaned toward him while speaking softly. Daniel smiled in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in years. Not love. Admiration. Validation. Vanessa made him feel important, and Daniel had become addicted to feeling important. Ethan followed my gaze quietly. That's her yes. He watched them carefully for a moment. She's ambitious. She's dangerous. Ethan nodded slowly. Daniel's blind. No, not blind. Just hungry. Hungry people ignore warning signs if they think something valuable waits at the end. A few minutes later, Daniel stood from the table to take a phone call. Vanessa remained seated, scrolling through something on her tablet. Then I noticed it. A Harper Lane internal expansion document partially visible on her screen. My blood ran cold. Ethan saw it too. His expression darkened immediately. That's confidential. I closed my eyes briefly. Daniel. Dear God, what had he done? The next morning, company-wide emails began circulating. Mandatory Executive Leadership Summit attendance confirmed. Special announcement from ownership. The entire building buzzed with speculation. And Daniel. He walked through those halls believing destiny was finally opening its doors for him. That afternoon, he came home unusually cheerful. I think next week changes everything, he said while pouring wine. I watched him quietly from across the kitchen. Why he smiled confidently. Because people at the top are finally noticing me. The words hurt more than he realized. Because I had noticed him from the very beginning. When he was broke. When he was kind. When he was still capable of loving someone without measuring their usefulness. And somehow, that version of Daniel Wallace had disappeared completely. As he lifted his wine glass, his phone buzzed again. This time, he left it face up on the counter. A message from Vanessa appeared on the screen. Can't wait for next week. You're closer than you think. Daniel grabbed the phone too late. Because I had already seen it, and for the first time since signing the divorce papers, I realized something terrifying. Daniel truly believed he was stepping into the best chapter of his life. He had no idea he was walking straight toward the moment that would destroy everything he thought he knew about power, about success, and about me. The morning of the leadership summit arrived wrapped in snow and silence. Chicago looked frozen beneath pale gray skies, while black cars lined the entrance of Harper Lane headquarters like pieces on a chessboard. Inside the building, tension hung in the air so heavily it almost felt visible. Executives moved faster than usual. Assistants whispered into headsets. Security teams checked credentials twice. Everyone knew something major was about to happen. No one knew exactly what. I stood inside the private executive suite staring at my reflection while Sophia adjusted the sleeve of my cream-colored blazer. You nervous? She asked gently. I let out a quiet breath, terrified, and I was, not because of the company, not because of the announcement, because in less than an hour, the man I had loved for nearly 3 decades would finally discover who I truly was. Sophia stepped back and smiled softly. You look powerful. I almost laughed. Powerful. What a strange word. People imagine power feels strong. Most of the time, it simply feels lonely. My phone buzzed softly on the table beside me. A message from Daniel. Good luck today. Big day for me. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Even now, even standing moments away from having his entire world shattered, he still had no idea. I typed slowly. I hope today shows you what really matters. 3 dots appeared as he started replying, then disappeared. No answer came. Maybe he was already entering the conference hall downstairs. The same hall where my secret was about to explode in front of the entire company. At 10 sharp, Ethan entered the suite. It's time. My heart started pounding immediately. Sophia handed me a folder containing the official ownership announcement while Ethan studied my expression carefully. You can still delay this, he said quietly. I shook my head. No more hiding. For years I had stayed invisible because I believed privacy protected peace. But silence also allowed people like Daniel to underestimate me, to diminish me, to decide my value based solely on appearances. Not anymore. The executive elevator ride down to the summit floor felt endless. When the doors finally opened, noise flooded toward us instantly. Hundreds of voices, corporate chatter, polite laughter, ambition. I remained hidden behind the private corridor while security prepared the stage entrance. Through the partially opened curtain, I could see the massive conference hall glowing beneath elegant lights. Rows of executives filled the seats. Senior leadership in front, regional managers directly behind them. And there, near the center of the front executive section, sat Daniel Wallace. Perfect navy suit, silver tie, confident posture. A man absolutely certain his future was about to improve. My chest tightened painfully. Even after everything, part of me still loved the man sitting there. Or maybe I loved the memory of who he used to be. Daniel leaned toward another executive beside him and smiled confidently. I watched him laugh, watched him adjust his cufflinks, watched him scan the room like a man waiting for destiny to recognize him. He looked happy. That almost broke me. Sophia touched my arm gently. "You okay?" "No," I whispered honestly. Then the lights dimmed. Conversations faded immediately. Michael Grant walked onto the stage beneath applause. Tall, calm, commanding. The public face of Harper Lane Holdings for nearly 20 years. "Good morning, everyone," he began. The giant screen behind him displayed the Harper Lane logo, while cameras streamed the summit to offices throughout the building. This company was built on vision, integrity, and leadership. Daniel sat forward attentively. Michael continued. "Today marks the beginning of a new chapter in our company's history." The room became completely silent. For decades, Harper Lane Holdings has operated under an unusual structure. While I have had the honor of serving as CEO, the true owner of this company has remained private. Murmurs spread instantly across the audience. Daniel's eyes sharpened with excitement. Michael smiled faintly. "That changes today." My pulse thundered in my ears. Then Michael said the words that changed everything. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the owner and majority shareholder of Harper Lane Holdings." He paused deliberately. "Vivian Wallace." The room exploded into stunned silence. For one surreal second, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Ethan stepped aside and I walked onto the stage. The lights felt blinding. Hundreds of faces stared at me in complete shock. And directly in the front row, Daniel froze. I will never forget that expression for the rest of my life. Confusion first, then disbelief, then horror. Pure horror. His face drained of color so quickly I thought he might collapse. Around him, executives immediately stood to applaud. One by one, the entire room rose to its feet. The sound echoed through the massive hall, while Daniel remained seated in absolute shock. His mouth parted slightly. His eyes locked onto mine like he was trying to convince himself this wasn't real. But it was. Every humiliation, every insult, every moment he treated me like I was beneath him, had happened while I quietly owned the entire company surrounding him. I stepped beside Michael at center stage. The applause continued. Some executives looked emotional, others stunned. A few board members smiled knowingly. And Daniel looked like a man watching his entire reality collapse in real time. I saw Margaret sitting several rows behind the executive section. Her face looked almost gray with shock. Beside her, Vanessa Carter stared at me in complete disbelief. Suddenly, every strange interaction, every moment Ethan showed me respect, every executive glance, every unanswered question, made horrifying sense to them all at once. Michael handed me the microphone. For one terrifying second, I almost couldn't speak. Then I looked directly at the audience. At Harper Lane, I began softly. We've always believed leadership is not about power. The room remained completely silent. It's about character. Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. I continued carefully. For many years, I chose to remain private because I believed people should be valued for who they are, not for status, wealth, or influence. Pain tightened inside my chest. Unfortunately, the world often forgets that lesson. The weight of my words spread visibly through the room, especially near Daniel. He looked physically ill now, like every cruel sentence he ever spoke to me was replaying inside his head all at once. I could almost see the memories hitting him. She mostly stays home. You don't understand this world. You're holding me back. She's too simple. Each insult now transformed into humiliation for him instead, because the simple woman he discarded was standing above every executive in the building. I kept my voice calm. Harper Lane will continue moving forward with integrity, accountability, and respect for every employee, regardless of title or status. Then my eyes briefly met Daniel's, only for a second, but it was enough. The devastation in his expression nearly shattered me. Not because he lost power, because he finally understood what he had done. The applause returned as I stepped away from the microphone. Executives stood again. Board members nodded respectfully. Cameras flashed. But through all the noise, I only saw Daniel, still frozen in his chair, still staring at me like he no longer recognized reality itself. And for the first time in 27 years, my husband finally understood that the woman he mocked for being poor had been the most powerful person in his entire world all along. The moment the summit ended, chaos exploded across Harper Lane. Executives whispered in stunned clusters throughout the hallways. Assistants rushed between offices, carrying tablets and confidential folders. Every phone in the building seemed to vibrate at once, and somewhere inside all that noise, Daniel Wallace's entire world was collapsing. I remained inside a secured executive conference room with Ethan, Sophia, and several board members, while security handled media containment downstairs. Even after the public announcement, I still hated attention, especially today, because beneath the corporate shock and strategic discussions, there was still a woman quietly mourning her marriage. Sophia handed me a tablet displaying internal reactions flooding through company channels. Employees were stunned, some inspired, others embarrassed by how openly certain executives had underestimated me. One message caught my attention immediately. Did Daniel Wallace seriously not know his own wife owned the company? I looked away from the screen quickly. The humiliation would destroy him. And despite everything, that realization still hurt me too. A knock sounded at the conference room door. Ethan looked toward security. "Who is it?" The answer came immediately. "Daniel Wallace." Silence filled the room. Sophia glanced toward me carefully. "You don't have to see him." But I already knew avoiding this moment would only make it worse. I inhaled slowly. Let him in. The door opened quietly, and for the first time in 27 years, Daniel looked afraid of me. Not intimidated, not nervous, afraid. His face was pale, his tie slightly loosened. The confidence he wore like armor for years had completely disappeared. He stepped into the room slowly, while several board members watched in uncomfortable silence. Daniel's eyes locked onto mine immediately. "Vivian." The sound of my name in his voice almost broke me, because suddenly he said it the way he used to. Softly, like I mattered. Too late. Ethan stood carefully. "We'll give you 2 minutes." The room slowly emptied until only Daniel and I remained. Silence stretched painfully between us. Finally, he spoke again. "You own Harper Lane." Not a question. A shattered realization? Yes. Daniel stared at me like he still couldn't process it. How long my father left it to me 20 years ago? He physically staggered backward a little. 20 years? 20 years of believing he understood me while knowing absolutely nothing. You... His voice cracked slightly. "You were the owner this entire time." "Yes." Daniel pressed a trembling hand against his forehead. Oh my God. I watched him carefully. The man who once mocked me for being ordinary now looked completely destroyed by the truth. And strangely, I felt no satisfaction, only sadness. Because this wasn't the victory people imagine in stories like this. Watching someone you loved realize they failed you so completely isn't satisfying. It's heartbreaking. Daniel finally looked up again. "Why didn't you tell me there it was?" The question everyone asks wealthy people. Why hide it? I answered honestly. Because I wanted someone to love me without seeing dollar signs first. His face twisted with pain. I loved you? I swallowed hard. You loved the version of me you thought was beneath you. That's not true, isn't it? My voice remained calm, but tears already burned behind my eyes. You humiliated me repeatedly, Daniel. He shook his head immediately. I didn't know that I was rich, I interrupted softly. Exactly. Silence, heavy, brutal. Because suddenly he understood the true horror of what he had done. Every insult, every condescending comment, every moment he treated me like I lacked value, had nothing to do with my character. Only with what he believed I could offer socially. Daniel looked sick. I never thought you were worthless. I stared at him quietly. You just treated me that way. His eyes filled with panic. No! Vivian, please. I had never seen him like this before. Not during layoffs, not during financial crises, not even when his father died years earlier. Because this wasn't career fear anymore. This was shame. Real shame. The kind that strips people down emotionally until they can no longer hide from themselves. Daniel stepped closer carefully. All those years, you were protecting me. I frowned slightly. What, you never used your position to influence my career? No. You let me earn everything myself. Yes. His voice cracked again. And I treated you like you were nothing. That sentence nearly shattered me. Because finally, he understood. Tears burned my eyes instantly, but I refused to let them fall. Daniel looked around the conference room helplessly before lowering his voice. Oh, God. Ethan knew. Yes, the board knew. Yes, and they watched me. They watched you underestimate your own wife for years. He closed his eyes like the humiliation physically hurt. And maybe it did. Because corporate embarrassment at that level destroys reputations quickly, especially inside executive culture. Daniel suddenly looked terrified. The ethics investigation. I stayed silent. His breathing quickened slightly. It's about Vanessa, isn't it, partly? But also about judgment, discretion, character. All the things ambition slowly eroded inside him. You shared confidential information? I said quietly. I didn't realize you didn't realize because you stopped thinking carefully. Daniel looked devastated. I swear I never intended to hurt the company. That was the tragedy. I believed him. He wasn't malicious, just arrogant. And arrogance blinds people long before it destroys them. Daniel took another step closer. Vivian, please tell me you're not doing this to punish me. The pain in his voice almost made me look away, but I forced myself to hold eye contact. I didn't expose myself publicly to punish you. Then why now? Because I was tired. Tired of hiding. Tired of shrinking myself so other people could feel powerful. Tired of being loved conditionally. But most of all, because signing divorce papers finally forced me to understand something painful. A man who truly loved me would never have needed proof of my value in the first place. I revealed myself because I'm done apologizing for existing quietly, I said softly. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. Real tears. I ruined everything. Part of me wanted to comfort him automatically. 27 years of loving someone trains your instincts deeply. But another part of me, the wounded part, stood frozen. Because where was this heartbreak when he mocked me publicly? Where was this grief when his mother called me ordinary? Where was this tenderness when he handed me divorce papers? Daniel covered his face briefly before speaking again. I thought you didn't understand my world. A sad smile touched my lips. Daniel, I built your world. The silence after that sentence felt endless. Then came another knock at the door. Sophia stepped inside carefully. Ms. Wallace? Her tone instantly shifted the atmosphere back into something corporate. Professional. Controlled. She handed me a confidential folder. The ethics committee finalized its preliminary review. Daniel visibly tensed. I opened the report slowly. Confidential disclosures verified. Executive misconduct review recommended. Temporary suspension pending further investigation. My chest tightened painfully. Daniel watched my face desperately. Vivian. I closed the folder gently. This decision isn't mine alone, but you could stop it. Yes. I probably could. One phone call, one executive override, one act of personal protection. But if I did that, everything I said on stage about integrity would become meaningless. I looked at him quietly. You spent years believing powerful people should be treated differently. Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. I was wrong. Yes, I whispered. You were. He looked up again, completely broken now, and for the first time since all of this began, I finally saw something familiar in him again. Not ambition, not arrogance, humanity. Too late, but real. Daniel's voice became almost unbearable to hear. I never stopped loving you. A tear finally slipped down my cheek. Maybe not, I said softly, but you stopped seeing me. And somehow, that hurt even more. By the end of the week, Harper Lane Holdings felt less like a corporation and more like a crime scene. Every conversation stopped when someone entered the room. Executives avoided eye contact in elevators. Phones rang constantly. And somewhere beneath all the panic, one truth slowly spread through the company like wildfire. Daniel Wallace had fallen from grace. 3 days earlier, people saw him as a future executive. Now they whispered his name like a warning. I sat alone inside my office overlooking downtown Chicago while snowstorm clouds darkened the skyline. The office itself still felt unfamiliar to me. For years, I had hidden behind private conference rooms and secure executive suites. Now my name sat openly on the door, Vivian Wallace, owner and chairwoman. Every time I looked at it, something inside me still resisted. Not because I was ashamed, because public power always felt colder than private purpose. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Come in. Sophia entered carrying another investigation file. Her expression alone told me this wouldn't be easy. We confirmed everything she said quietly. My stomach tightened immediately. Vanessa Sophia nodded. She intentionally pursued Daniel after learning he was moving upward inside Harper Lane. Pain spread slowly through my chest. Not jealousy, just sadness. Daniel truly believed Vanessa admired him. But to people obsessed with status, admiration is often just strategy wearing perfume. Sophia placed photographs and printed emails across my desk carefully. Hotel meetings, private dinners, forwarded expansion notes, fragments of internal planning documents. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to prove Daniel violated confidentiality policies. Enough to destroy executive trust. I stared at the evidence in silence. He never understood what she was doing, Sophia added gently. I know. That was the tragedy. Daniel wasn't a mastermind. He was a man starving for validation, and Vanessa knew exactly how to feed that hunger. My office phone buzzed softly. Ethan. Vivian, he said immediately, we have another problem. What happened? Vanessa Carter is denying everything. Of course she was. She claims Daniel pursued her and voluntarily shared information to impress her. I closed my eyes briefly. And Daniel. He's falling apart. Those words hit harder than I expected, because, despite everything, part of me still cared whether he was hurting. "I'm coming downstairs," I said quietly. The executive review room on the 32nd floor felt colder than usual. Legal advisors lined one side of the table. Ethics officers filled the other. And seated near the center was Daniel. He looked exhausted, not physically, spiritually, like someone who hadn't slept since the summit announcement. The second he saw me enter, shame flooded his face instantly. No arrogance left. No performance. Just a broken man confronting the ruins of his own choices. Vanessa sat several seats away, wearing a perfectly tailored white suit and an expression of controlled innocence. The moment she looked at me, I understood something important. She still didn't fully grasp who I was emotionally. She understood my power now, but not my pain. To her, this was still a strategic disaster to survive. To me, it was the collapse of a marriage. The lead investigator began calmly. "This review concerns potential breaches of confidentiality and misuse of internal corporate information." Vanessa folded her hands gracefully. "I've done nothing improper." Daniel looked at her in disbelief. "You asked me about expansion plans?" She turned toward him smoothly. "You discussed your work constantly, Daniel. I assumed you understood professional boundaries." I watched his face break a little more, because suddenly he realized something devastating. Vanessa had never been risking herself emotionally. Only him. "You encouraged it," he whispered. She gave a sad little shrug. "You're a grown man." The cruelty of that sentence sat heavily in the room. Daniel stared at her like he was finally seeing her clearly for the first time. Not glamorous, not sophisticated, calculated. The investigator slid printed emails across the table. "Ms. Carter, can you explain why you requested projected acquisition maps and executive transition timelines?" Vanessa remained calm. "I'm involved in commercial real estate investment. I was curious. Curious enough to request confidential strategic projections." Silence. Daniel rubbed trembling hands across his face. Oh my God. I looked down quietly, because this wasn't satisfying anymore. It was just sad. Painfully sad. The investigator turned toward Daniel next. "Did you knowingly share restricted information?" Daniel swallowed hard. "Yes." The room fell silent. No excuses, no deflection, just truth. That alone told me how shattered he truly was. Why, the investigator asked carefully. Daniel laughed bitterly under his breath. "Because I wanted to seem important." The honesty in that answer stunned everyone. Even Vanessa looked uncomfortable. Daniel stared down at the table while speaking quietly. "I thought she respected me." Vanessa immediately interrupted. "I did respect you." "No," Daniel said hollowly. "You respected access." Silence again. I looked away because hearing him finally understand everything hurt more than I expected. For years, Daniel had measured people through ambition and status. Now he was discovering what it feels like to become someone else's social ladder. The investigator cleared his throat. "Ms. Wallace, as owner of Harper Lane Holdings, do you wish to make any statement before we conclude?" Every eye in the room turned toward me, even Daniel's. I inhaled slowly, then stood. "I believe accountability matters," I said calmly. My voice echoed softly through the conference room. "But I also believe human failure is rarely simple." Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. I continued carefully. "Daniel Wallace violated company policy. That's true." Pain tightened inside my chest. "But he is not a criminal mastermind." The legal team remained silent. "He is a man who lost perspective while chasing validation." Daniel's breathing visibly shook. And Ms. Carter? I looked directly at Vanessa. She recognized vulnerability and exploited it. Vanessa's expression hardened slightly for the first time. Interesting. Finally, something cracked through her polished mask. The lead investigator nodded slowly. Understood. After the meeting ended, people slowly filed out in silence. Vanessa left first without looking at anyone. Legal teams followed, then Ethan, then Sophia, until only Daniel and I remained again. The room suddenly felt unbearably quiet. Daniel sat motionless, staring at the table. Finally, he spoke. She never cared about me. I answered honestly. No. He laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. I threw away 27 years for someone who saw me as a useful idiot. The self-hatred in his voice made my chest ache. You didn't throw it away for Vanessa, I said quietly. He looked up slowly. You threw it away long before her. Daniel's eyes filled instantly, because he knew I was right. Vanessa wasn't the cause. She was simply the mirror reflecting what ambition had already turned him into. He stared at me for a long moment before whispering, "How did I become this person, God?" That question nearly broke me, because once upon a time, Daniel Wallace was kind, funny, warm, a man who danced barefoot in kitchens and believed love mattered more than status. I still remembered him clearly, which somehow made this even more tragic. You stopped being grateful, I said softly. Daniel closed his eyes and started worshiping success instead. A tear slipped down his face. Real, uncontrolled, not for his career, not for his reputation, for himself, for the man he realized he had become. And in that moment, for the first time in years, I finally saw genuine remorse instead of wounded pride. But sometimes, remorse arrives after too much damage has already been done. Daniel Wallace was officially suspended 3 days later. Temporary removal from leadership consideration. Restricted access to internal systems. Mandatory ethics review. In corporate language, those words sounded clean and professional. But in reality, it was public humiliation, especially for a man who built his entire identity around success. I watched the news spread through Harper Lane from the quiet safety of my office while snow melted slowly outside the windows. Nobody said it directly, of course. Executives rarely speak openly about disgrace. But I saw it in their eyes during meetings, the pity, the gossip, the satisfaction from competitors who once envied Daniel's rise. Corporate culture has a cruel habit of worshiping people on the way up and abandoning them on the way down. And suddenly, Daniel was falling. Fast. Sophia entered my office carrying updated reports. He cleared out his office this morning. Something inside me twisted painfully. How did he look? Tired. I nodded slowly. That made 2 of us. Sophia hesitated before adding, "He asked if you were coming to the building today." I looked away toward the skyline. "What did you say?" "That I didn't know." A silence followed. Then Sophia stepped closer carefully. "You don't owe him anything, Vivian." I almost smiled sadly. Maybe not. But love doesn't disappear just because respect does. That was the difficult part nobody talks about after betrayal. You can know someone hurt you deeply, and still mourn the version of them you once adored. Later that afternoon, Ethan arrived with final recommendations from the ethics committee. "They're not terminating him," he said immediately. Relief moved through me before I could stop it. Ethan noticed. "He'll likely be reassigned after probation instead." I sat quietly for a moment. That's fair. It's more generous than most corporations would be. Maybe. But despite everything, Daniel didn't deserve complete destruction. Consequences. Yes, humiliation, perhaps unavoidable, but annihilation. No, I never wanted revenge. I only wanted dignity. Ethan studied me carefully across the desk. You still love him? It wasn't a question. I looked down at my hands. I love who he used to be. That's not the same thing. No, I whispered. It isn't. That evening, I returned home earlier than usual. The house felt emptier now. Daniel had moved into the guest bedroom after the summit without us ever formally discussing it. Like both of us, silently understood the marriage no longer belonged in the same room. I had just removed my coat when the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Margaret Wallace stood there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She looked smaller somehow, less polished. Fear does that to people. It strips away performance. May I come in? She asked quietly. I stepped aside without answering. Margaret entered slowly, clutching her designer handbag like armor. This woman had spent years making me feel inferior. Now she looked terrified to even stand in my home. The irony wasn't satisfying, just tragic. I know I'm the last person you want to see, she began carefully. I folded my arms. You're right. Margaret lowered her eyes immediately. That alone shocked me. This woman never lowered her eyes, not to anyone. I owe you an apology. I stayed silent. Her voice trembled slightly. No, more than one. We stood in the living room surrounded by the ghosts of 27 years. Christmas mornings, birthday dinners, movie nights, family arguments, love, pain, everything lingering invisibly in the walls. Margaret swallowed hard. I judged you terribly. Yes, she had. For years. You thought I was beneath your son? I said quietly. Tears filled her eyes immediately. Yes. The honesty startled me. I thought Daniel deserved someone wealthier, more connected, more impressive. There was that word again. Impressive. As though human worth existed to decorate social status. Margaret looked around slowly. And all this time, you were the most powerful person any of us had ever met. I shook my head softly. No, I was just a woman who loved your son. That broke her completely. Tears slid down her cheeks while she sat heavily onto the couch. I destroyed my own family, she whispered. I remained standing. Because part of me still couldn't forget every cruel thing she said. Every comparison. Every humiliation. Every moment she encouraged Daniel to see me as inadequate. Margaret covered her face briefly. When Daniel was little, his father left us with nothing. I frowned slightly. She had never spoken about Daniel's father before. We lost the house, she continued shakily. I worked 3 jobs trying to survive. Something softened painfully inside me. After that, I became obsessed with security. Money, status. Her voice cracked. I convinced myself wealth protected people from suffering. I sat down slowly across from her. But it doesn't. No, she whispered. It just changes the shape of suffering. Silence settled between us. Not comfortable, but honest. Finally, Margaret looked at me again. He's falling apart, Vivian. My chest tightened immediately. He barely leaves the house. He stopped answering friends. He started seeing a therapist yesterday. I stared down at my hands quietly. Good. Not because he was hurting. Because maybe for the first time in years, he was finally looking inward instead of upward. Margaret leaned forward desperately. Please don't destroy him completely. I met her eyes slowly. I haven't, but you could. Yes, I could. That was the terrifying reality of power. I could erase Daniel professionally if I wanted to, and maybe part of him feared that possibility every second now. But cruelty had never interested me. I spent too many years watching wealthy people use power like a weapon. I refuse to become one of them. I won't interfere further, I said calmly. Margaret looked confused. You won't help him? I thought about that carefully before answering. No. Her eyes filled with disappointment. Why? Because saving him from consequences would teach him nothing. Because some people only change after losing everything they built their identity around. And because protecting him now would mean betraying myself again. He needs to face what he became, I said softly. Margaret cried quietly into her hands. And strangely, I pitied her too, because somewhere beneath all her obsession with status and appearances was simply a frightened woman terrified of being powerless again. That night after she left, I walked slowly through the dark house alone. Daniel's office door remained closed upstairs. I could hear faint movement inside, drawers opening, footsteps, silence. For several minutes, I stood outside the door without knocking. Part of me wanted to go inside, to comfort him, to hold him, to pretend none of this happened. But love without respect eventually becomes self-destruction. And I finally understood that now. Just as I turned to leave, the door opened suddenly. Daniel froze when he saw me standing there. He looked exhausted, unshaven, eyes red from sleepless nights. Nothing like the polished executive obsessed with appearances just weeks earlier. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked quietly, "Did my mother come here?" "Yes." He looked ashamed immediately. "She shouldn't have done that. She came to apologize." Daniel laughed bitterly under his breath. That must have been terrifying for her. Despite everything? I almost smiled. Then his expression turned serious again. "I started therapy. That surprised me." "I know." He nodded slowly. "The therapist asked me when I first started believing success determined human value." Pain flickered across his face. I didn't know how to answer. I looked at him quietly, because I already knew the answer. It happened slowly, one promotion at a time, one compliment at a time, one ego boost at a time, until ambition replaced gratitude completely. Daniel swallowed hard. "I don't expect forgiveness?" Good. Because forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing, and some damage changes people permanently. But as I stood there looking at the broken man in front of me, I realized something important for the first time in years. Daniel Wallace finally seemed more afraid of losing his soul than losing his status. And maybe that was the beginning of becoming human again. 3 months after the summit, I moved out of the house. Not because the lawyers forced me to. Not because Daniel asked me to leave. Because I finally understood something painful. You cannot heal in the same place where your spirit slowly broke apart. The penthouse overlooked the Chicago River from 40 floors above the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows, soft gray walls, quiet, peaceful, lonely. The movers finished around sunset while I stood near the balcony, holding a small framed photograph from 20 years earlier. Daniel and me, younger, laughing. Still innocent enough to believe love automatically protected people from becoming strangers. I placed the photograph face down inside a drawer. Not out of anger, out of acceptance. Some memories deserve tenderness, but they no longer deserve control over your future. "You okay?" Sophia's voice interrupted my thoughts gently from the kitchen area. She had insisted on helping me settle in despite my protests. I smiled faintly. "I think so." She handed me a glass of wine before leaning beside me near the window. "You know," she said carefully, "most people expected you to become colder after all this." I looked out at the city lights below. I was afraid of that too. But strangely, the opposite happened. After spending years shrinking myself inside a marriage built on conditional respect, I finally started feeling honest again. Free, not happy exactly. Healing isn't happiness. It's quieter than that, less dramatic, more like learning how to breathe normally after years underwater. The next few months changed my life in ways I never expected. For the first time in decades, I began appearing publicly as owner of Harper Lane. Business magazines requested interviews. Charity organizations invited me to speak. Women I had never met sent letters describing marriages that sounded painfully familiar. One message stayed with me more than the others. I spent 30 years believing my husband's success made me invisible. I cried reading it, because invisibility destroys people slowly, especially women over 50. Society teaches us that our value fades with age unless we remain useful to someone else. Beautiful enough, helpful enough, quiet enough. I spent years accepting that lie. Not anymore. That realization became the beginning of the Wallace Initiative, a foundation supporting older women rebuilding their lives after financial dependence, emotional neglect, or divorce. Housing assistance, career retraining, legal support, therapy resources. Every meeting with those women changed me. One woman escaped a 40-year marriage where her husband controlled every dollar she spent. Another had secretly sold homemade jewelry online for years because her family mocked her dream of becoming an artist. A 72-year-old widow cried in my office because nobody had asked what she wanted in over 20 years. And suddenly, I realized something heartbreaking. Women like us spend entire lifetimes being underestimated. Not loudly, quietly, systematically, until eventually, we start underestimating ourselves too. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I finished speaking at a women's leadership conference downtown and returned to the office exhausted. Sophia stepped into my office holding a small envelope. No return address. I frowned slightly. What is it? She handed it to me silently. The handwriting stopped my heart immediately. Daniel. I waited until she left before opening it. Inside was a single handwritten letter. Vivian, I know I no longer deserve long conversations from you, so I'll keep this simple. Therapy is forcing me to confront parts of myself I spent years avoiding. That's painful, but necessary. For most of my life, I believed success would make me feel worthy. I kept climbing because I thought achievement could silence insecurity. Instead, it slowly turned me into someone who measured human value the same way corporations measure assets. Useful or not useful, impressive or ordinary. And somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing the extraordinary woman standing beside me every single day. Not because you lacked value, because I became blind. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect another chance. I just needed you to know that I finally understand what I destroyed. Not my career, not my reputation. Us. You loved me when I had nothing. And I repaid that love by making you feel like you weren't enough. I will regret that for the rest of my life. Daniel. I sat there staring at the letter for a very long time, then quietly cried harder than I had in months. Not because I wanted him back, because this was the first honest thing he had said in years. A week later, Ethan knocked lightly on my office door. You have a visitor downstairs. I looked up from my laptop. Who? He hesitated slightly. Daniel. My chest tightened immediately. I didn't schedule anything. I know. I stared at the skyline through the windows for several silent seconds, then nodded once. Send him up. When Daniel entered my office 10 minutes later, I barely recognized him. Not physically, Emotionally, the arrogance was gone completely. No expensive watch, no polished executive performance, just a tired man carrying genuine humility for the first time in years. He stopped several feet from my desk. "You look good," he said softly. I almost smiled. "So do you." It was partly true. Pain had changed him, stripped him down into something more honest. Daniel glanced around the office awkwardly. "You really built all of this." "I inherited it," I corrected gently, "then protected it." He nodded slowly. I used to think power made people important, and now his eyes met mine. Now I think character does. Silence settled between us. Not hostile, not romantic, just real. Daniel reached into his coat pocket nervously. "I brought something." He handed me a small velvet box. Confused, I opened it carefully. Inside sat my old wedding ring, the simple silver band I stopped wearing after signing the divorce papers. "I found it in the bathroom drawer," he said quietly. I stared at it for several seconds. Memories flooded through me instantly. The proposal, the vows, the young couple who once believed love alone was enough. "I'm not asking you to wear it again," Daniel added quickly. "I know. I just thought it belonged to you." Tears burned my eyes unexpectedly. Because after everything, he finally understood something simple but important. Love isn't ownership. People aren't possessions, and respect matters more than appearances ever will. Daniel looked down at the floor briefly before speaking again. "I don't want your money." "I know. I don't want a position at Harper Lane." "I know." He swallowed hard. "I just wanted to apologize to you face to face without excuses." I studied him quietly, and in that moment, I realized something surprising. I believed him. Not because he suffered consequences, because he changed. Real change feels different from guilt, quieter, less performative, more painful. Daniel looked at me carefully. "Do you think you could ever forgive me?" I thought about that question honestly, then answered with the truth. "I already do." His eyes filled immediately. But forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. And I think he understood that too, because neither of us mentioned starting over. Some love stories don't end with reunion. Some end with understanding. And maybe that can still be beautiful. The divorce became official on a quiet Tuesday morning in early spring. No dramatic courtroom battle. No screaming. No bitterness left sharp enough to cut. Just signatures. Final papers. Two exhausted people acknowledging that love alone had not been enough to save what they destroyed together. When the judge finalized everything, Daniel looked at me across the courtroom with tears quietly resting in his eyes. Not pleading, not manipulative, just grieving. And strangely, I was grieving too. Not for the marriage itself. That had died long before the paperwork. I was grieving the young couple we used to be, the version of us untouched by ego status and disappointment. Outside the courthouse, Chicago air carried the first warmth of spring. People rushed past us on sidewalks, holding coffee cups and briefcases, while the city continued moving forward without caring that 27 years had just ended. Daniel stood beside me awkwardly. "Well," he said softly. I almost smiled through the sadness. Well. For a moment, neither of us knew what to do next. Then he surprised me. "I'm moving to Milwaukee." I blinked slightly. "Really?" He nodded. "A smaller consulting firm offered me a position." "How do you feel about that?" Daniel looked out toward the street. Honestly, I waited quietly, relieved. That answer caught me off guard. He laughed softly at my expression. For the first time in years, I'm not chasing some impossible version of success. The old Daniel would have considered Milwaukee a professional downgrade. The new Daniel sounded peaceful, and somehow that mattered to me. I'm glad I said sincerely. He looked at me carefully. You changed my life, Vivian. Tears burned my eyes unexpectedly. I think we changed each other's. A long silence followed. Then Daniel reached into his coat pocket and handed me another envelope. What's this? I wrote it after therapy last month. I frowned slightly. You already sent me a letter. This one's different. I looked down at the envelope but didn't open it yet. Daniel stepped backward slowly. You don't have to read it now. Okay. His eyes lingered on me for one final moment. Then he smiled sadly. You know, I used to think losing the company was the worst thing that happened to me. I looked at him quietly. What do you think now? His voice cracked slightly. Losing your respect. God, that nearly broke me. Because after everything, part of me had waited years to hear those words. Not for revenge, for acknowledgement. Daniel swallowed hard. You were the best thing in my life long before I knew you were powerful. Tears slipped down my cheeks silently, and I was too blind to see it. I stepped forward before I could overthink it and hugged him. Not romantically, not desperately, just human beings saying goodbye to a shared lifetime. Daniel held me carefully like something fragile, and for one heartbreaking moment, I felt the man I originally married again. Then we let each other go. No promises, no dramatic reconciliation. Just truth. And maybe truth is the purest form of love left after everything else burns away. That evening, I stood alone on the rooftop terrace of Harper Lane Holdings, while the Chicago skyline glowed gold beneath the setting sun. Wind moved softly through my hair, while the city stretched endlessly below me. Beautiful, restless, alive. Ethan stepped onto the terrace carrying 2 glasses of champagne. Thought you might need this? I smiled faintly. You know I still hate champagne. Yes, he said dryly, but tonight feels symbolic. I accepted the glass anyway. For several minutes, we stood in comfortable silence, watching the city lights flicker awake one by one. Finally, Ethan asked quietly, How do you feel? I thought about that carefully. Because for so long, I imagined this moment differently. I thought exposing the truth would feel victorious, powerful, satisfying. But standing there now, I realized healing doesn't feel triumphant. It feels calm. I feel free, I answered softly. Ethan nodded slowly. That suits you better than revenge would have. I smiled a little. I never wanted revenge. I know. That was the strange thing about all of this. People expected anger from me, punishment, public destruction. But pain had already done enough damage. I didn't want Daniel ruined. I wanted him awake. And somehow, I think he finally was. After Ethan left, I remained alone on the rooftop long after sunset. Eventually, I opened Daniel's final letter. Vivian, there's one last truth I need you to know. For years, I convinced myself you were ordinary, because I needed to feel extraordinary. That realization has haunted me every day since the summit. You spent our marriage loving me quietly while I spent years trying to impress strangers. And the cruelest part is this. The moments I was happiest were never the promotions, never the recognition, never the status. It was dancing with you in the kitchen, watching movies during thunderstorms, listening to you laugh over terrible takeout food. You were never holding me back. You were the only thing keeping me human. I understand now that you didn't hide your wealth to test me. You hid it because you wanted to be loved normally. And I failed that love in ways I'll regret forever. But thank you for loving me before ambition made me someone unrecognizable. I hope one day you love someone who sees your value immediately. Daniel. By the time I finished reading, tears blurred the city lights completely. Not because I wanted him back, but because grief and love can exist together long after a relationship ends. I folded the letter carefully and looked out across Chicago one final time. Then something unexpected happened. I smiled, a real smile. Small, peaceful, because for the first time in years, I no longer felt invisible. Not to the world, not to myself. The truth was, I had spent so much of my life trying to be easy to love that I forgot my worth never depended on someone else recognizing it. Not a husband, not society, not status, and certainly not money. The woman Daniel mocked for being poor had always been wealthy in the ways that mattered most. Loyalty, kindness, patience, heart, and finally, she understood that too.